The room was sterile, smelling of antiseptic and the distinct, sharp odor of rubbing alcohol, a scent that was supposed to signify healing but, for many African American women in the mid-20th century, often signaled a different kind of danger. It was a doctor's office in Harlem, a space that should have been a sanctuary of care, yet often functioned as a theater of power imbalances. Bumpy Johnson, a woman known for her grace, her sharp wit, and her standing as the wife of the most powerful man in Harlem, sat on the examination table. She was there for a routine checkup, a mundane necessity of life. The physician, a man whose professional title granted him a veil of unquestionable authority, moved about the room with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was a man who believed that his white coat insulated him from the realities of the street outside, that the diploma on the wall was a shield against the consequences of his actions. He looked at Mamie, not as the wife of a king, but as a subject, a woman alone in a room where he held all the cards. Or so he thought. The atmosphere in the room shifted imperceptibly at first. It was in the way his gaze lingered too long, the way his questions veered away from the clinical and into the personal, the way the professional distance began to collapse into something predatory. Mamie, a woman who had navigated the complex social hierarchies of Harlem since her arrival from North Carolina in 1938, sensed the change. She knew the look of a man who thought he could take what he wanted. But she also knew something that the doctor did not. She knew that in Harlem, there were two sets of laws. There was the law of the city of New York, written in statutes and enforced by police officers who often viewed the neighborhood with disdain. And then there was the law of the street, the law of respect, the law of the Godfather. The doctor, consumed by his own hubris, made a fatal miscalculation. He walked to the door of the examination room. The sound of the lock clicking into place was loud in the quiet room. It was a sound that was meant to seal Mamie in, to isolate her, to strip her of her agency. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. He turned back to her, a smirk playing on his lips, secure in the knowledge that the door was locked, that they were alone, that his status protected him. He did not know about the closet. He did not know that the shadows in the corner of the room held a presence far more terrifying than any medical diagnosis. He did not know that Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to the world as Bumpy, was standing just a few feet away, hidden in the darkness, watching. Bumpy Johnson was not a man who trusted the world with his wife. He knew the way men looked at her. He knew the way the world treated black women, and he knew that his power, vast as it was, meant nothing if he could not protect the one person who mattered most. He had slipped into the office unseen, a ghost in a suit, utilizing the stealth that had allowed him to survive gang wars and prison riots. He had waited in the closet, silent, his breathing shallow, his eyes adjusting to the sliver of light coming through the crack in the door. He had watched the doctor's movements, he had heard the tone of his voice, and then he heard the lock click. To the doctor, the locked door meant permission. To Bumpy Johnson, it meant war. The door to the closet burst open. It wasn't a slow reveal, it was an explosion of motion. Bumpy Johnson stepped out, his frame filling the room, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the air. He didn't need a weapon. He didn't need to shout. The sheer impossibility of his presence was enough to shatter the doctor's reality. The physician spun around, his face draining of color, his arrogance evaporating instantly into a cold, hard terror. He was looking at the face of a man who was rumored to have killed for less, a man who ruled the Harlem underworld with an iron fist, a man who was known as the Sovereign of 7th Avenue. Bumpy looked at the doctor, then at the locked door, then back at the doctor. The silence that stretched between them was heavier than any threat. The doctor realized, in that freezing moment, that he had locked himself in a cage with a lion. He had thought he was the predator, but he was nothing more than prey. This incident, whispered about in the beauty parlors and barbershops of Harlem for decades, was not just a story about a jealous husband. It was a defining metaphor for the life and reign of Bumpy Johnson. It showed that his reach was limitless, that no door was truly locked to him, and that the protection of his family was the one line that could never be crossed. To understand how a man could command such fear and respect, how he could become a figure who could hide in a doctor's closet and terrify a professional man into submission without lifting a finger, we must go back to the beginning. We must go back to the South, to the violence that birthed him, and to the streets of Harlem that he would eventually claim as his kingdom. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. His birth on Halloween seemed almost prophetic for a man who would become a boogeyman to his enemies and a masked protector to his friends. He was born into a world where the color of his skin dictated his destiny, a world of Jim Crow laws and racial terror. His nickname, Bumpy, which would one day be whispered with fear across the 5 boroughs of New York, came from a simple physical trait, a small bump or knot of abnormal growth on the back of his head. As a child, it was a source of teasing. As a man, it became a brand name for power. But the South was not a place where a young black boy with a fierce temper and a refusal to bow down could survive for long. The pivotal moment of his childhood, the event that would set him on the path to Harlem, occurred when he was just 10 years old. His older brother, Willie, was accused of killing a white man. In Charleston in the early 20th century, such an accusation was a death sentence, not just for the accused, but often for the entire family. The specter of the lynch mob, the rope, and the fire loomed over the Johnson household. Afraid of the violence that was sure to come, his parents mortgaged their tiny home, scraping together every penny they had to save their children. They sent Willie up north to live with relatives, a desperate attempt to outrun the hangman. But they worried about Ellsworth, too. As he grew older, his parents noticed his short temper, his sharp tongue, and his absolute insolence towards white people. In the South, insolence was a capital crime. They knew that if he stayed, he would eventually cross the wrong white man, and there would be no saving him. So, in 1919, at the age of 14, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, was part of the Great Migration, sent to live with his older sister Mabel in Harlem. He arrived in New York City not as an immigrant seeking fortune, but as a refugee seeking survival. He carried with him the trauma of the South, the knowledge that the law was not a protector but a predator, and a burning resolve never to be a victim again. Harlem in the 1920s was a revelation. It was the era of the Harlem Renaissance, a time when black art, literature, and music were exploding onto the world stage. It was a black metropolis, a city within a city where African Americans were building a new identity. But for a teenager with no high school diploma and a chip on his shoulder, the literary salons and jazz clubs were a world away. Bumpy dropped out of high school and began working casual jobs, trying to find his footing in the concrete jungle. He was small, he had a thick Southern accent that made him a target for bullying, and he was poor. But Bumpy Johnson had something that the bullies didn't account for. He was a scrapper. He learned to fight on the streets of Harlem, turning his rage into a weapon. He refused to be pushed around, and his willingness to throw hands, to use a knife, to do whatever was necessary to win, caught the attention of the local underworld. He began hanging around an unsavory crowd, the hustlers and the gamblers who operated in the shadows of the Renaissance. It was here that he met William "Bub" Hewlett, a gangster who saw potential in the scrappy kid from Charleston. Hewlett brought Johnson into the fold, and Bumpy began working for him as a bodyguard for high-rolling illegal gamblers. This was his education. He learned the geography of the streets, the hierarchy of the gangs, and the importance of reputation. He learned that in Harlem, respect was the only currency that mattered, and violence was the mint that printed it. By the time he was 30, Bumpy Johnson had spent nearly half his life in prison. He was arrested more than 40 times, serving terms for burglary, pimping, and assault. These prison stints were not setbacks, they were semesters in the University of Crime. He learned from older inmates, he hardened his resolve, and he began to cultivate the intellectual side of his personality that would baffle his enemies. He read history, philosophy, and literature. He became a master chess player. He realized that brute force was useful, but strategy was invincible. When he was released from prison in 1932, he returned to a Harlem that had changed. The Great Depression had ravaged the economy. The optimism of the Renaissance was fading, replaced by the desperate struggle for survival. Unemployment in Harlem was skyrocketing, and the only businesses that seemed to be thriving were the illegal ones. Bumpy was broke and unemployed, a convicted fill-on with few prospects in the legitimate world. But the underworld remembered him. He returned to the streets and crossed paths with a woman who would change the trajectory of his life and the history of Harlem, Madame Stephanie St. Clair. St. Clair was a legend in her own right. Known as Madame Queen, or Queenie, she was an immigrant from the French Caribbean, specifically Martinique, though she often claimed to be from France to add an air of European mystique to her persona. She was fierce, she was brilliant, and she was the undisputed queen of the Harlem policy rackets. To understand the world Bumpy Johnson was about to conquer, one must understand the numbers game. In the 1920s and 30s, the numbers racket was not just a criminal enterprise, it was the lifeblood of the Harlem economy. It was the Black Wall Street, a financial system created by and for the community in response to the white banking system's refusal to serve them. As Langston Hughes once noted, the numbers were the salvation of Harlem. Its Medicare, its vitamins, and its aspirin combined. It was a game of chance where residents would bet pennies, nickels, or dimes on a 3-digit number. If their number hit, the payout was 600 to 1. For a washerwoman making a few dollars a week, a hit on the numbers could mean paying the rent, buying new shoes for the children, or putting food on the table. It was hope sold in paper slips. The genius of the system lay in its randomness and its reliance on external financial indicators. The winning numbers were derived from the daily financial reports of the New York Clearing House, an institution that facilitated exchanges between banks. Every morning at 10:00 a.m., the Clearing House would release its daily exchange totals and balances. The numbers bankers would take the second and third digits of the millions from the clearing's total and the third digit from the balance's total to create the day's winning 3-digit number. It was an elegant, transparent system. Because the Clearing House figures were published in the daily newspapers like the New York World or the Sun, every player could verify the winning number for themselves. It was virtually impossible to fix, which gave the game a reputation for integrity that the legal lotteries of the past had lacked. The entire neighborhood revolved around this daily ritual. In the mornings, an army of runners would fan out across Harlem. They were the foot soldiers of the operation, collecting bets from apartments, barber shops, beauty salons, and street corners. They carried dream books, small pamphlets that interpreted dreams into numbers. If you dreamed of a cat, you played a certain number. If you dreamed of a funeral, you played another. The dream books were bestsellers in Harlem, outselling the Bible in some quarters. The runners would take the bets and the money to the controllers, who would then funnel the cash to the bankers, the kings and queens who held the capital to pay out the winners. This was a massive industry. By the mid-1920s, the numbers game in Harlem had an estimated annual turnover of 20 million. It employed thousands of people, runners, controllers, clerks, lookouts, at a time when legitimate jobs were scarce. Stephanie St. Clair sat at the top of this pyramid. She had arrived in Harlem in 1912 and, with an initial investment of 10,000, had built a policy empire. She was a woman operating in a male-dominated criminal world, but she refused to be intimidated. She fought corrupt police who tried to shake her down, taking out ads in local newspapers to publish the badge numbers of officers who demanded bribes. She was flamboyant, wealthy, and unapologetically black. But by the early 1930s, her empire was under siege. The end of Prohibition was looming, and the white mobsters, specifically the Jewish and Italian gangs, were looking for new revenue streams. They looked uptown at the millions of dollars flowing through the hands of black bankers and decided it was time to take over. The primary aggressor was Dutch Schultz. Born Arthur Flegenheimer in the Bronx, Schultz was the beer baron, a ruthless, violent bootlegger who saw Harlem not as a community, but as a territory to be conquered. He looked at the numbers game and famously dismissed the black bankers as penny, ante, hustlers who didn't know how to organize. He declared he was taking it all. Schultz didn't ask, he invaded. His men began beating runners, smashing up betting parlors, and kidnapping bankers to force them to turn over their operations or pay him a percentage. It was a hostile corporate takeover enforced by machine guns. Most of the smaller black bankers folded. They were businessmen, not warriors. They couldn't compete with the violence Schultz was bringing to their doorsteps. But Stephanie St. Clair was different. She was not going to hand over the empire she had built to a white invader without a fight. She needed a general, someone who understood violence, someone who wouldn't blink in the face of the Dutchman's terror. She found Bumpy Johnson. Fresh out of prison, broke but hungry, Bumpy became St. Clair's chief enforcer. This partnership sparked a legendary gang war that would turn the streets of Harlem into a battlefield. It was a war of asymmetry. Schultz had the money, the political connections, and the heavy weaponry. But Bumpy had Harlem. He knew the terrain. He knew the alleyways, the rooftops, the cellars. He utilized the geography of the neighborhood to wage a guerrilla war against the invaders. Bumpy and his crew of 9 picked soldiers turned Harlem into a trap for Schultz's men. As Mamie Johnson later wrote in her biography, picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy since there were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. A white gangster in a suit stood out on 125th Street like a beacon. Bumpy's men would spot them, track them, and eliminate them. They used knives, ice picks, and guns. They dropped heavy flower pots from rooftops. They made the streets unsafe for any of Schultz's collectors. It was brutal, bloody work. Over 40 murders and numerous kidnappings were attributed to this conflict. Bumpy was fearless. He wasn't just fighting for money, he was fighting for sovereignty. He He was fighting for the idea that Black Harlem should be run by black people. Despite their tenacity, the war was costing them dearly. Schultz had the police in his pocket, paying off officers and judges to harass St. Clair and Johnson. St. Clair was arrested, jailed and stripped of much of her wealth. The pressure was immense. Schultz was relentless, backed by the vast resources of his bootlegging empire. He was winning the war of attrition. But Bumpy Johnson was playing a longer game. He understood that in the underworld, power was shifting. The old ethnic gangs were being reorganized. The Italians, led by Charles, Lucky, Luciano, were modernizing organized crime, creating a structured commission that sought stability and profit over chaotic violence. Dutch Schultz was a problem for the new mafia. He was erratic, violent, and drew too much heat. He wanted to assassinate Thomas Dewey, the special prosecutor who was investigating the mob, a move the commission knew would bring the full weight of the federal government down on all of them. Bumpy Johnson saw an opening. He reached out to Luciano. This was a move of supreme tactical brilliance. A black gangster from Harlem negotiating with the head of the Italian mafia was unheard of. But Luciano was a businessman, and he respected strength. He saw that Schultz was unable to fully pacify Harlem because of Bumpy Johnson. He saw that Bumpy commanded the loyalty of the streets in a way Schultz never could. In 1935, the commission ordered the hit on Dutch Schultz. He was gunned down in the bathroom of the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. As he lay dying in the hospital, delirious and mumbling, he received a telegram. It read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." It was signed, Madame Queen. Stephanie St. Clair had the last word. With Schultz dead, the path was clear for a new order. Bumpy Johnson negotiated a peace treaty with Lucky Luciano. It wasn't a perfect victory. The Italians would still take a slice of the profits from the numbers game. But it was a peace with honor. Bumpy successfully argued that Harlem could not be run by outsiders. He would run the rackets. He would handle the enforcement. He would be the king. In exchange, the mafia would provide protection from the law, access to heroin supplies, a controversial and dark turn in the story, and financial backing. This deal made Bumpy Johnson the most powerful black criminal in America. He was no longer just an enforcer. He was a partner. He had stood up to the white mob and forced them to the negotiating table. To the people of Harlem, this elevated him to the status of a folk hero. He was the man who had stopped the invasion. He was the man who kept the Italians out of the neighborhood, even if he was working with them. He became the gatekeeper. Nothing moved in the Harlem underworld without Bumpy Johnson's permission. But a king needs a queen, and Stephanie St. Clair, weary from the war and facing legal troubles, began to step back, eventually handing over the reins of the operation to Bumpy. Bumpy's life was entering a new phase, one where he sought to balance his criminal empire with a semblance of normal life. This desire for normalcy, for a touch of the respectable, led him to Mamie Hatcher. Mamie was everything Bumpy was not: innocent, law-abiding, and deeply religious. Born in North Carolina in 1915, she had moved to New York in 1938, finding work as a waitress at Hager's, a club owned by singer Ethel Waters. She was a church-going woman, a class act, who held herself with dignity. They met in a restaurant on 7th Avenue in 1948. Bumpy had just been released from a 10-year stint in Dannemora prison. He walked in, saw Mamie, and was instantly captivated. Mamie, however, wasn't impressed. She brushed him off initially. But Bumpy was persistent. He sat down and began to talk to her. Not about crime or the streets, but about books, about philosophy, about the world. Mamie was shocked. Here was this notorious gangster, a man whose name terrified grown men, quoting literature and speaking with the eloquence of a professor. The duality of the man intrigued her. They left the restaurant together, went to the movies, and a romance was born. 3 months later, in October 1948, they were married. It was a civil ceremony that united the underworld and the church. For Bumpy, Mamie was his sanctuary. She represented the life he might have had if the world had been different. He was fiercely protective of her, keeping his business dealings completely separate from his home life. He didn't bring work home. Mamie knew who he was, of course. You couldn't live in Harlem and not know who Bumpy Johnson was. But she chose to see the man, not the myth. She saw the husband who was generous to a fault, the man who loved chess, the man who wrote poetry. Their marriage was a partnership based on loyalty. Mamie became the historian of his legacy, the woman who would eventually write Harlem Godfather, to set the record straight about her husband. But being Mrs. Bumpy Johnson came with its own set of challenges. It meant navigating a world where respect was demanded and slights were punished. Which brings us back to the doctor. That incident in the closet wasn't just an act of jealousy, it was an act of governance. In Bumpy's mind, He was the sovereign of Harlem. His subjects were under his protection, and his wife was the crown jewel. By attempting to take advantage of Mamie, the doctor wasn't just assaulting a woman, he was insulting the king. When Bumpy stepped out of that closet, he was enforcing the law of the street. You do not touch what belongs to the Godfather. Bumpy's rule over Harlem was complex. He was a criminal, yes. He controlled the numbers racket, and later the distribution of heroin, a decision that would devastate the community he claimed to protect. This is the dark paradox of Bumpy Johnson. He was a poisoner and a protector simultaneously. He used the profits from his crimes to fund a shadow welfare state. He gave away turkeys on Thanksgiving, paid for coal for freezing families in the winter, and covered tuition costs for promising young students. He was known to pay the rent for people facing eviction. This philanthropy wasn't just a cover, it was a genuine, albeit twisted, sense of civic duty. He believed that since the white government wouldn't help Harlem, he had to. This sense of justice, vigilante, brutal, and swift, is perhaps best illustrated by the story of his nephew Thomas Johnson. This narrative, passed down through oral history and detailed in accounts of Harlem lore, showcases the lengths Bumpy would go to when the legal system failed his people. It was 1946. World War II had just ended. Black soldiers were returning home, hoping that their service abroad would translate to respect at home. But racial tensions were high. The Ku Klux Klan was not just a Southern ghost, it had cells operating in the North, shadows moving in the cities. Thomas Johnson was 19 years old. He was Bumpy's nephew, the son of his sister Ruth. Thomas was the pride of the family. He wasn't a gangster, he was a scholar. He was a student at Columbia University, pre-law. He wore thick, rimmed glasses and carried books, dreaming of fighting injustice in the courtroom with writs and arguments, not on the street with knives and guns. He represented the future of the Johnson family, the legitimacy Bumpy could never achieve. On the morning of September 15, 1946, Thomas walked through Marcus Garvey Park on his way to the Abyssinian Baptist Church. It was 6:00 a.m., a quiet Sunday morning. He never made it to the church. A group of 5 white men, members of a secret Klan cell operating out of a warehouse on East 98th Street, were waiting for him. They weren't wearing hoods, they didn't fear identification because they believed the police wouldn't care. They wanted to send a message to Harlem. Colors know your place. They chose Thomas because he was educated, because he was successful, because he was uppity. They ambushed him. Thomas fought, but he was small and outnumbered. They dragged him to an old oak tree near the park's north entrance. They put a rope around his neck. They lynched him. It was a slow, agonizing death. They pinned a note to his chest. Colors know your place. Then they left him hanging there for the morning joggers to find. When the police arrived, Detectives Walsh and Sullivan saw the body. They saw the note. They saw the Columbia student ID. And when they realized the victim was Bumpy Johnson's nephew, they knew a storm was coming. But the system was the system. Detective Walsh knew that a jury in 1946 would likely not convict 5 white men for killing a black boy, and arresting them might cause a riot. So, in an act of cowardice and corruption that defined the era, they filed the report as a suicide. They cut him down, notified the family, and tried to wash their hands of it. Bumpy got the call at 7:12 a.m. His right-hand man, Illinois Gordon, broke the news. They're saying suicide, boss. But there was a note. KKK. Bumpy went to his sister Ruth's house. He held her as she wept, her grief a raw, open wound. She told him, the police said suicide. My boy would never. Bumpy promised her then and there, I'm going to handle this. It was a promise that meant death. Bumpy went to the park. He didn't look for police tape, he looked for clues. He found cigarette butts, boot prints, a torn button, and a matchbook from Allie's Tavern. He found a homeless witness named Curtis who had seen the men and heard a name, Danny. Bumpy used his network. A bartender at Allie's Tavern confirmed that a group of 5 white men had come in early that morning, drunk and bragging about teaching a Columbia Negro a lesson. He got the names Danny Morrison, Rick Sullivan, Lou Bennett, Frank Dorsey, and Charlie Ross. Bumpy called his council of war, Illinois Gordon, Willie Lee, Quick Jackson, and Marcus Cole. These were men who had walked through fire for him. 5 names, Bumpy told them. They lynched Thomas. Now they pay. He didn't just want them dead. He wanted them to understand. He wanted them to feel the terror they had inflicted on his nephew. He wanted to dismantle the entire Klan cell in New York. We're going to teach them that Harlem doesn't scare. The retribution was biblical. Danny Morrison, the ringleader, was taken in his own garage. Bumpy's men bound him with the same type of rope he had used on Thomas. They hoisted him up, let him choke, lowered him, and hoisted him again. They made him feel the suffocation 3 times before they finished him. They left a note on his chest. 1 down, 4 to go. Harlem remembers. Rick Sullivan was a factory worker. He came home to find his garage smelling of gasoline. The doors were locked from the outside. A match was thrown through the mail slot. He burned alive, surviving only long enough to suffer in agony for months before dying. The note outside read, "You burned crosses. Now you know how fire feels." Lou Bennett was a hunter. Bumpy's men tracked him into the woods upstate. They didn't kill him immediately. They hunted him. For 3 days, they stalked him, making noises, whispering Thomas's name from the trees, driving him into a state of psychological collapse. When he was found, he was alive, but his mind was broken, shattering under the weight of the ghosts pursuing him. Frank Dorsey moved his family to a hotel to hide. Illinois' Gordon burned his house down while it was empty, destroying every possession, every memory, every photo Frank owned. A note on the mailbox read, "You destroyed a family's future. Now you understand loss." Finally, Charlie Ross. He tried to turn himself in to the police to escape the wrath of Bumpy Johnson. Illinois' Gordon intercepted him. He gave Charlie a choice. "You're not going to prison. You're going to your Klan meeting tonight. You're going to tell them to disband and leave New York, or we burn them all down." Charlie delivered the message. 10 of the Klan members voted to stay and fight. 5, including Charlie, fled. As the 10 men sat in their warehouse planning their defense, Molotov cocktails crashed through the windows. The doors were chained shut. The warehouse burned to the ground with the Klan members inside. The police ruled it an accidental fire. In 7 days, the KKK cell in Harlem was eradicated. 12 men were dead or destroyed. The message was clear: Harlem protects its own. Bumpy stood at Thomas's funeral, placing photographs of the justice he had exacted into the casket. He had delivered the only justice available to a black family in 1946. He had become the law because the law had failed. This event solidified Bumpy Johnson's position not just as a gangster, but as a necessary evil. He was the monster who kept other monsters at bay. But his reign was not without its interruptions. The federal government, unable to catch him on the violence, eventually caught him on the drugs. In 1952, at the height of his power, Bumpy was indicted for drug conspiracy. The trial was a sensation. Bumpy claimed he was framed, that he had tried to keep hard drugs out of Harlem initially, but the evidence, or perhaps the government's determination, was enough. He was sentenced to 15 years. He was sent to Alcatraz, the inescapable fortress in San Francisco Bay. Inmate number 1117. For many men, Alcatraz was the end. For Bumpy, it was another kingdom to conquer. He didn't rule with fists in Alcatraz, he ruled with his mind. He was respectful to the guards, he mediated disputes between inmates, and he commanded the respect of the white mobsters imprisoned there. He spent his time in the library, devouring books on law, history, and philosophy. He played chess, becoming a grandmaster behind bars. He wrote poetry, sending sensitive, thoughtful verses to Mamie back in Harlem. There is a persistent legend about Bumpy's time in Alcatraz, one that speaks to his reach even while incarcerated. In 1962, 3 inmates, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, escaped from the Rock. It is the most famous prison break in history. They made dummy heads to fool the guards, dug through the walls with spoons, and launched a makeshift raft into the freezing waters of the bay. They were never seen again. The official story is that they likely drowned. But the streets tell a different story. The theory explored in shows like Unsolved Mysteries is that Bumpy Johnson orchestrated the logistics from the inside. He supposedly used his connections with the Italian mafia to arrange for a boat to be waiting in the bay to pick them up. If true, it means Bumpy Johnson defeated the ultimate symbol of American incarceration. He didn't just survive Alcatraz, he outsmarted it. Bumpy was released in 1963. He returned to a Harlem that was buzzing with the energy of the civil rights movement. When he stepped out of the car on 125th Street, he was met with a hero's welcome. There was an impromptu parade. People cheered. The king was back. But the Harlem of 1963 was not the Harlem of 1952. The drug trade had become vicious. The old codes of honor were eroding. And there was a new fire burning in the community, lit by a man named Malcolm X. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X is one of the most fascinating intersections of crime and politics in American history. They were two sides of the same coin, both charismatic leaders, both feared by the white establishment, both dedicated to black empowerment, but through vastly different means. They had known each other from the streets. Malcolm had been Detroit Red, a hustler, before he found Islam. When Malcolm broke with the Nation of Islam in 1964, he was a marked man. The nation wanted him dead. The police wanted him silenced. Malcolm needed protection, but he couldn't go to the police. He went to Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson respected Malcolm. He saw in him the intellectual and spiritual leadership that the community needed. Bumpy provided Malcolm with a security detail of his toughest soldiers. For a time, the gangster protected the revolutionary. It was a surreal alliance, guards armed with illegal weapons standing watch over a man preaching righteousness. But eventually, Malcolm asked Bumpy to withdraw the guards. He felt that he couldn't lead a moral movement while surrounded by known criminals. He told Bumpy, "I can't teach them to follow the law if I'm being protected by men who break it." Bumpy disagreed, arguing that a dead martyr helps no one, but he respected Malcolm's wish. He pulled his men back. Weeks later, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom. Bumpy was devastated. He reportedly sat in his office and wept, calling Malcolm a dead prince. He felt that if his men had been there, Malcolm would still be alive. The death of Malcolm X seemed to drain some of the fight out of Bumpy. He was getting older. The streets were getting colder, and new challengers were rising. This brings us to the myth of Frank Lucas. If you've seen the movie American Gangster, you've been told a specific story that Frank Lucas was Bumpy Johnson's quiet driver for 15 years, his protégé, the man who inherited the kingdom when Bumpy died in his arms. It's a great Hollywood story. Denzel Washington played it beautifully. But according to Mamie Johnson and the historical record, it is a lie. In her book Harlem, Godfather, Mamie Johnson dismantled Frank Lucas's claims with the precision of a surgeon. She pointed out the timeline discrepancies. Bumpy was in prison for much of the time Lucas claimed to be driving him. She stated clearly that Bumpy did not respect Lucas, viewing him as a flunky and a loudmouth, not a successor. Bumpy Johnson didn't have a successor. He was a singular force. The idea that he passed the torch to Lucas was, in Mamie's eyes, a fabrication by a man trying to steal valor from a dead king. The reality was that when Bumpy died, the structure he built collapsed because no one else had the intellect, the charisma, and the ruthlessness to hold it together. The end came on July 7, 1968. It wasn't in a hail of gunfire. It wasn't in a prison cell. It was at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, a favorite spot for the Harlem elite. Bumpy was 62 years old. He was eating breakfast, coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits, surrounded by friends. He was under federal indictment again, facing another drug conspiracy charge that would likely send him away for life. He was tired. Just before 2:00 a.m., he clutched his chest. He collapsed into the arms of his childhood friend, Junie Bird. The heart that had pumped ice water during gang wars and warmed to poetry in the quiet hours finally gave out. He died as he lived in Harlem, surrounded by his people. The news spread like a shockwave. Bumpy is dead. It signaled the end of an era. The funeral was massive. Thousands of people lined the streets, weeping for the man who had been their bank, their protector, and their legend. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Mamie Johnson survived him by 41 years. She never remarried. She lived quietly in Philadelphia in her later years, but she never let the world forget who her husband was. In 2008, a year before her death at age 94, she published her biography. She wanted to reclaim the narrative from the movies and the rumors. She wanted people to know the man who hid in the closet to protect her honor. She wanted them to know the man who read philosophy in solitary confinement. She acknowledged his crimes. She never claimed he was a saint, but she insisted on his humanity. So, what is the legacy of Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson? It is easy to label him a villain. He sold heroin. He ordered murders. He was a criminal who profited from the vices of his community. These are facts. But history is rarely black and white, especially in Harlem. To the people who lived under his reign, he was a necessary response to a broken system. When the banks wouldn't lend to them, Bumpy did. When the police wouldn't protect them, Bumpy did. When the KKK tried to lynch their children, Bumpy burned them down. He was the sovereign of 7th Avenue, a king in a country that didn't want him to exist. The story of the doctor and the locked door is the perfect epitaph for his life. He was the monster in the closet, waiting in the dark. But for the people of Harlem, he was their monster. And as long as he was watching, no door was ever truly locked against them. Let's step back and look closer at the engine that powered this empire, the numbers. To understand Bumpy, you have to understand the economy of hope he controlled. In the 1920s and 30s, the clearing house numbers game was an obsession. It was invented largely by a man named Casper Holstein, a Virgin Islander who studied the stock market from a janitor's closet. He realized that the New York clearinghouse financial totals published in the newspapers were random enough to serve as a lottery. Before this, lotteries were clumsy, physical drawings susceptible to rigging. Holstein's system was elegant. It used the daily financial pulse of white America to feed the dreams of black America. The game had a rhythm. It was the heartbeat of the streets. You had the bankers at the top, men like Holstein and later Bumpy. Below them were the controllers, the middle management who handled the logistics, and on the ground were the runners. A runner was a neighborhood celebrity. He was the man with the cash, the man with the news. He'd walk into a tenement building, and people would come out of their doors with slips of paper and coins. Put a dime on 527, a woman might say. Why 527? Maybe she dreamed of a fish. Maybe she saw a license plate. Maybe she just had a feeling. The dream books were the Bible of the trade. Titles like The HP Dream Book or Policy Pete's Dream Book were sold in every stationery store in Harlem. They were dictionaries of symbols. A rat might mean 456. A police officer might be 2E12. If you dreamed of a funeral, you looked it up, found the number, and played it. It was a superstition, yes, but it was also a form of cultural literacy. It gave people a sense of control over their destiny. In a world where a black man could be fired for looking a white man in the eye, the numbers game offered a fair shake. If you picked the right number, you got paid. It didn't matter who you were. The numbers didn't discriminate. The payout of 600 to 1 was staggering. A 10-cent bet could win you 60. In 1930, 60 was 2 months' rent in some tenements. It was a fortune. And when someone hit, the news traveled fast. Sweet Cider hit the number, or Mrs. Jones hit for 500. These stories fueled the game. They were the marketing campaign. But for the bankers, the game was about volume. Millions of pennies and nickels add up. By 1931, the daily turnover in Harlem was estimated at nearly 300 zalozen. That's millions in today's money, flowing through the streets every single day, completely untaxed, completely unregulated. This creates power, and power attracts predators. This is why the war with Dutch Schultz was inevitable. The white mob saw this river of cash and realized they were missing out. They had dismissed it as nigger pool, a game for pennies. But when they did the math, they realized the pennies were adding up to millions. Schultz's invasion was not just a gang turf war, it was an act of colonization. He wanted to mine Harlem of its wealth. He forced the black bankers to pay him protection, or he forced them out entirely. He put his own men in the counting houses. He streamlined the business, making it more corporate, more ruthless. He cut the percentages for the runners. He fired black workers and hired whites. This is where Bumpy Johnson's role becomes historically critical. He wasn't just fighting for his own pocket, he was fighting for the employment of the neighborhood. When he organized the resistance, he wasn't just organizing gunmen. He was organizing a labor strike. The black controllers and runners went on strike against Schultz. They refused to collect slips. They refused to turn over money. They paralyzed the system. Schultz could kill a few men, but he couldn't kill the entire workforce. He couldn't walk into the tenements himself and collect the bets. He stood out too much. He needed the black runners. Bumpy knew this. He leveraged the community's solidarity against the invader. The violence was the sharp edge of the spear, but the solidarity was the shaft. Bumpy made sure that anyone working with Schultz was ostracized. If you took the Dutchman's money, you weren't just a traitor to Bumpy, you were a traitor to the race. This narrative was powerful. It turned a criminal enterprise into a civil rights struggle. Keep the money in Harlem became the battle cry. When Schultz was killed, the relief in Harlem was palpable. The 1,000 number that hit that day, Dutch's number, was seen as divine intervention. But the reality was more pragmatic. Bumpy's deal with Luciano was a compromise. The Italians were smarter than Schultz. They didn't want to run the day to day. They didn't want to be seen in Harlem. They wanted a cut, and they wanted peace. Bumpy gave them that. He became the CEO of Harlem operations. He ensured the money flowed. He ensured the violence was kept house. And he ensured that the Italian families got their envelopes. In return, they gave him access to the heroin connection. This is the tragedy of Bumpy Johnson's later years. The numbers game was, relatively speaking, a benign vice. It was gambling. But heroin was different. Heroin destroyed the very community Bumpy claimed to love. It hollowed out families. It turned the streets into a zombie land. Did Bumpy feel the contradiction? Mamie's book suggests he struggled with it, that he tried to limit the damage, but the money was too great, and the momentum of the drug trade was unstoppable. He was riding a tiger. He couldn't get off without being eaten. In Alcatraz, stripped of his empire, Bumpy had to confront himself. The letters he wrote to Mamie from prison reveal a man of deep sensitivity. He wrote about the view of the San Francisco skyline, so close yet so far. He wrote about the fog rolling in under the Golden Gate Bridge. He wrote poetry about lost time and enduring love. He wasn't just a thug serving time, he was a philosopher in a cage. He read legal briefs, helping other inmates with their appeals. He became a jailhouse lawyer. fighting the system with paper instead of guns. The chess games in Alcatraz were legendary. He played against the birdman of Alcatraz, Robert Stroud. Though they were in different cell blocks, they reportedly communicated moves. He played against guards. He played against the Italian mob bosses who were locked up with him. Chess was the perfect game for Bumpy. It requires patience, sacrifice, and the ability to see 10 moves ahead. It was the game he had played on the streets of Harlem his whole life. When he returned in 1963, the world had shifted on its axis. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Martin Luther King Jr. was marching. The youth were angry. Bumpy was an old lion in a new jungle. His connection with Malcolm X was a bridge between two eras. Malcolm respected Bumpy's strength but rejected his methods. Bumpy respected Malcolm's vision but doubted his safety. The tragedy is that both men were right. Malcolm was right that the community needed to move beyond crime to find freedom. Bumpy was right that without protection, the leaders would be slaughtered. When Malcolm died, a part of Bumpy died with him. He saw the futility of it. He saw that no matter how righteous you were, a bullet could still find you. He saw that the system, the white power structure, was vast and unyielding. He retreated further into his own world, trying to hold onto his territory against the encroaching FBI and the ambitious young dealers like Frank Lucas who didn't have his code of honor. Frank Lucas represents the degradation of the gangster code. Lucas didn't care about the community. He cared about blue magic, heroin, and profit margins. He bypassed the Italian mafia to get drugs directly from Southeast Asia, which was a brilliant business move but a social disaster. He flooded the streets with high-purity heroin that killed thousands. Bumpy Johnson viewed this kind of reckless greed with disdain. He was from an era where a gangster still had to answer to his neighbors. Lucas was from an era where the neighbors were just customers. The creepy doctor story, then, stands as a monument to the code Bumpy lived by. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about drugs. It was about respect. It was about the sanctity of the black woman in a world that tried to degrade her. That doctor represented everything Bumpy fought against: the entitlement of the powerful, the exploitation of the vulnerable, the violation of trust. By hiding in that closet, Bumpy became the ultimate guardian. He was the monster who kept the other monsters away. In the end, Bumpy Johnson is a Rorschach test for Harlem. If you look at him one way, he is a parasite, a man who grew rich on the addiction and gambling of poor people. If you look at him another way, he is a hero, a man who stood tall when black men were expected to bow, a man who fed the hungry and protected the weak. Both images are true. That is the complexity of the man. That is why, decades later, we are still telling his story. He was the bump on the head of New York City, the knot that couldn't be smoothed out, the force that couldn't be ignored. He was the Godfather, and in the dark closet of history, he is still there, watching, waiting, and reminding us that some doors should never be locked.